see everyone back here today. I've been looking forward to getting to spend this time with you. And as always, we will take a break about halfway through. And I was talking about this when I was doing a self-care training, that we all have to multitask so much in our lives. And a lot of us will say like, oh, women are better at multitasking, or, I'm really good at multitasking. And that's kind of true, but it's not really true. When they've done studies about this, what we find is that, first of all, the for lack of a better word, the attention circuits in your brain really can't focus equally on two things at one time, two different things at one time. What it can do is switch very quickly back and forth, so quickly that it might feel like you're paying equal attention at the same time. But there is that shifting going on, and we know a couple of things about that. Number one, I hate to say this to my sisters, because I was one of those people who walked around saying women are better at this. And the truth is, statistically, the differences between the sexes in terms of multitasking are pretty small. Bummer. The other more important thing for you to know is that nobody does it very well. That when you give people tasks and then you ask them to multitask, their performance always goes down, as opposed to when they're just doing one thing at one time, which really shouldn't be terribly surprising. The other thing that we know is that your brain uses up more energy than any other organ in your body. And I don't think we quite know exactly how attention and decision making affects the brain. There's still some conflicting data about that, but there seems to be a consensus that it certainly doesn't help us in terms of that feeling of fatigue when we are multitasking. And I feel like our culture keeps encouraging us to do this. Do your banking while you're pumping gas and schedule your dentist appointment. I get it, and there's convenience in that at times, but it is probably draining us faster and reducing our ability to focus and pay attention. So all of this is just to say that we hear over and over again about how draining the holiday season can be, especially those of us, if you are also a parent, or you're caring for aging parents, or you have lots of different hats that you wear at work or whatever. So one of the things that I want to invite you to do today, if it's possible, and I understand that for some of you, if you're on call or there's a situation that's kind of blowing up, that you may have to be also responding to texts or sending emails or whatever. But I remember having your kinds of jobs when I worked in the mental health field. And I was always schlepping my notes to a meeting and secretly trying to catch up on my paperwork or whatever. So I deeply sympathize with that. And if you are someone who has to be stepping out, or you've got to be checking things while we're here today, I 100% feel you and get where you are. But if you don't have to do that, and if you're like me these days and it's kind of more of a habit, I'm going to invite you to do something. And it truly is just an invitation, so you can do it or not. But if you can put your phone down, maybe set it aside. As I mentioned before, you can take notes if that helps you. We're also sending out, I believe, supplemental materials that will cover everything I'm talking about today. I really invite you to just be here if that's something that's available to you. A, because I just think it's nicer, but B, because it really is a nice opportunity to not overtax our brains, because our brains get pretty tapped out, I would say, especially at this time of year. So that's something I'm going to offer to you guys. The other thing, of course, that I'll remind you of is I've been checking the comments section. I think people are mostly kind of, just sort of checking in at this point. But I would love to hear questions, comments, your experiences, your expertise. I feel like that always adds to the group. And so I will be checking those, when we come back from break or when we wrap up for the day. So please feel free to jump in and do that. And now, without any more introduction, we are going to come to that exciting part of the day where I'm going to try to share my slides. So everyone send me some good thoughts and let's see how this goes. And I believe everybody can share my screen or can see my screen. So let me know if somebody can. Oh, Alyssa just said we can. Thanks, Alyssa. Gotcha. Okay. So as you remember, last time we started talking about What is actually happening in our brains, in our nervous system, in our whole body when something in our environment is signaling to us that we are not safe. Now, that may be something that is what anybody would consider an actual threat, like there's a fire alarm going off or something like that. Or it might be something that, for whatever reason in our experience, we have coded as something threatening. It's kind of like if you've ever gotten food poisoning right after you ate something. Like I can't even say the words cotton candy to my sister. I'm usually not, sometimes I do, but I'm usually nice in not doing that. So, normally that might not be a trigger for you, but if you've experienced whatever, I have a friend who can't even hear the word SpaghettiOs. So, those can be very individually linked. So where someone else wouldn't react, you would. That's sort of the whole ball game when we're talking about triggers with trauma, right? A little woman with dark hair and glasses probably wouldn't trigger most people, but if your experience has been linked to traumatic stress with someone who looks like this, so you get the point. Something neutral can then become something that the brain codes as a threat. I also want to point out one more thing here. We know that when people have generational trauma, because there does seem to be a genetic interplay there that we're still learning about, or when someone has just had sort of a traumatic or anxious time growing up, your brain will also default more to the unknown being threatening. For a neutral brain, for lack of a better word, if there's some unknown thing happening, like you're walking through the park and you hear rustling in the bushes, your first reaction is to go to attending. So you might turn your head and look at it. But if you are somebody or you're working with somebody who has already had traumatic stresses in their life, even though that rustling may not be directly coded to something traumatizing, their brain is more likely to decide that anything unknown is automatically dangerous, right? So they don't go to, oh, that's new. What is that? They go right to, this is a threat, which is why I think a lot of the folks that we work with, or if you know people who are struggling with trauma, new things are challenging, or environments where there's a lot of stimulation and they can't quickly identify what all the noises are or what all the sights are. The example I use is, let's say somebody with combat PTSD who then goes to their nephew's sixth birthday party. Now, they're obviously not expecting that there's going to be a firefight at that party, but there may be a lot of sort of low level noise and activity that their brain can't immediately recognize and categorize. And so their alarm system may be shut up, it may be turned up because their brain is going to default to whatever's new or whatever I can't immediately recognize and identify. I'm already going to go into that alarm system. Okay. So once again, I think folks who work with folks like on the autism spectrum, or if you've got kids that maybe have some of that they're more neurodiverse, you're probably already aware that when they are potentially reacting to something that you're trying to get them to do that's new or out of their routine, they're not just being rigid to be jerks. I don't pretend to say that we know all the things that might be going on in a neurodiverse brain, but I do think that bias towards this is new, this is unfamiliar, I'm going to react like it's a threat. We certainly see a lot of overlap with that and with trauma. So that's I think helpful to keep in mind when even small deviations can create what look like oversized reactions to things. Now, what are we talking about when we say that the brain is going to react as if something is a potential threat? Well, as we talked about last time, and we'll just sort of pick up and review a little bit here, you can really only do a couple of things. And this is true from the littlest amoeba to, us walking around, that obviously things get more complex as organisms get more complex, but the reflexes are pretty similar. You're either going to do something into your environment to try to make it safer, or you're going to try to contract. Okay. So when we are mobilized for safety, and that's how I like to think about that fight flight state, what we also called hyperarousal. Remember, we talked about that what happens in the brain is the amygdala, that little sort of almond-shaped freckle that would be at the bottom corners of your thumb if your hand were your brain. The amygdala is constantly sorting through at all times what's happening around you and inside of you. So paying attention to like, are your muscles soft or are they tense? Is your stomach upset or is it relaxed? But it's taking in all of that information all the time, and it's always asking a single question. Is Lara safe? Not your brains. Your brains aren't asking if I'm safe. They don't care. Your brains are asking if you're safe all the time. That's the amygdala's job. And kind of, I think, like a smoke detector, I think it's a pretty good analogy. If there's anything that suddenly pops in the environment, like, too many smoke particles in the air or whatever, then the amygdala is going to answer the question, am I safe? No. And it triggers this whole cascade of reactions in the brain. Your brain starts producing a lot of norepinephrine and cortisol, among other things. And that triggers the release of adrenaline in the body from the adrenal glands on top of your kidneys. So I'm really emphasizing here, this is a whole body reaction. It's much quicker than you can consciously think. When I'm working with my trauma clients, I always emphasize this, that you cannot outthink these reactions. They're almost as quick as a reflex, tenths of a second. Okay. And the reason I go into that is taking us all the way back to the beginning of the training last week, which was people are not choosing to do these things. You can only recognize them once they've already started. So the thing I work on with my trauma clients is once you recognize that you are in your mobilized state, you're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, or you're shut down, which we'll review again in a second, but those are two sides of the same coin, right? You're going to be mobilized for safety or you're shut down for safety. This happened before you could recognize or think or decide about it. Okay. So once you recognize it, you can maybe make some choices. Oh, I need to re-regulate myself because I am dysregulated. But you can't outthink it. You can't get there before your nervous system has already done something to try to keep you safe. We evolved over millions of years to survive based on these very deep systems. When I talk with my clients about this, it's important because sometimes they don't like how they react or it causes other struggles for them. And they can sometimes blame themselves as if it were a choice. It is not a choice. Your brain and body are taking care of you long before your conscious brain that's aware of states and has that self-reflection and self-awareness and can make decisions and choices. That part of the brain is very late to the party, maybe half a second behind, which in brain time it is pretty slow. So I also emphasize it with you guys because if you are working with an adult or a kid or whomever you're working with, and they are in their fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or they are in collapse and dissociation, it's very important that we not hold them responsible as if they're making decisions because they're not. They didn't choose to be triggered into whatever state they are in. Now, once people start regulating and they come back into their window of tolerance, which is this slide, as you guys remember, right? So the red zone is the fight, flight, freeze, fawn when we are mobilized for safety. And the blue band at the bottom, hypoarousal, is when we shut down and kind of collapse in on ourselves. We may sort of check out. I'll talk more about that in a second. But once I come back into that middle range, which, as you remember last time, this is sort of where we wrapped up. This is what trauma therapists will call the window of tolerance or the window of accommodation. It just means when we're in that middle window, whatever's going on around us is not setting off our alarm system. It's within our experience, or we're experiencing it neutrally or positively or whatever, it's fine. Okay. Most of us spend most of our lives, hopefully, in that window. But a lot of the folks we work with have lives that look more like this, or in some cases, like that. So they spend relatively little time in their window. And you guys know this. I remember working when I worked in a partial hospitalization setting with teenagers. We had a lot of kids where if something set them off, that was it. That's your day. That's your day. You're going to spend the day trying to get this kid regulated and calmer and able to function again. So Now, knowing what I know, this was probably the brain pattern and the nervous system pattern that I was looking at. Someone who had a very narrow window. It took very little to set them off, and it took a long time to come back down. And I want to remind all of us that this is how every brain and nervous system is built. It is not specific to people with developmental disabilities or people who are neurodiverse or people who have a mental illness of some kind or what have you. All of our brains work essentially this way. So, we talked last time as well about how when we are in these states ourselves, it's helpful to be able to recognize it once we realize that we're no longer in our window of tolerance. So, going to the work of Deb Dana, who is a wonderful therapist and she does great training. She's written a couple of books. She works a lot with Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory for working with trauma. Some of you who are interested in trauma may be familiar with this. If you're not, don't worry about it. It's part of a longer, more expanded training that we do about trauma. So if you're interested in learning more, that might be something we can do. But for right now, don't worry about it. It is simply a way of, again, including the nervous system in the all throughout the body and understanding what's going on. So what she developed, and I've adapted a little bit for these slides here, but I wanted to make sure to give her credit. She developed this worksheet to work with clients. I use this with clients as well sometimes. So that first row across the top, ventral vagal, again, that refers to the vagal nerve. Don't worry about that. But the engagement zone here just means whatever level is comfortable for you to be engaging with the world is where you are. Okay. I often think of it as like a fence, like our boundaries are a fence, and then there's a gate that opens and closes. So for some of us, if you're more withdrawn or you're more introverted, then you don't engage a lot with the world, but you can. And if you're more extroverted, maybe you engage a lot more. The issue here is whatever is your normal, whatever is your baseline, where you feel safe in your body, you're able to be social to whatever extent is typical for you. And a lot of the folks that we work with that are neurodiverse, their social engagement looks pretty different than some other people's. But whatever they're comfortable, I'm okay, everything's fine, normal is, that's what we're talking about here. And she encourages her clients, and I'm now going to encourage this with you guys, to think about what does it feel like in your body when you are in that state where everything's okay, your amygdala is checking out the environment and saying that there's nothing that's concerning. What does it feel like in your body? Does your heart feel slow? Does your breath feel deep? Does your stomach feel relaxed? Stuff like that. What are your emotions? You feel fine, okay, hunky dory, everything's cool, whatever. You feel relaxed or optimistic or whatever. And then what are your thoughts? Probably like, what am I going to have for lunch? So kind of steady state, window of tolerance, everything's cool. The code word at the end there is just, and this is something I do with therapists or with my clients in therapy, we just have sort of a shorthand for talking about where they are. And then, of course, you see where we're going with this. When we are in sympathetic states, the sympathetic nervous system is sometimes easy to think of as the gas, right? So when we are mobilized, activated, paying a lot of attention or excited about something, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. In this case, when we're talking about trauma reactions, we're saying that we are mobilized for safety, remember that, and we're in perhaps one of those 4F states. So we're trying to get away, we're in fight, we're going to try to be aggressive and fight it, we're in fight. We're frozen, hoping that, whatever the threat is will go away. But again, very activated, and we can switch into one of the other ones. So I can be frozen, and then when the coast is clear, run away. And then finally, fawn, which we talked about being when we are moving closer to a threat to try to neutralize it. And I'll just review that very quickly. Both male and female identifying people can go into that state. We already kind of socialize women to do that, to appease, to smile, to be placating. So we do tend to see it more in women, but men can absolutely do it as well. And that is because for most of us in the lives that we lead day to day, a lot of danger that we might be encountering would be from another person, right? So it could be a car crash or something like that. But if it's an angry person, which is how many of us may have experienced a sense of of being unsafe than if we're trying to calm them down or soothe them or flatter them or laugh or be flirtatious or sexual or whatever it is. That's a fear reaction, and that is an attempt by our nervous system to reduce the threat. Okay, so the four F's we've got when we're mobilized. What do those feel like? I can tell you for me, when I'm triggered into one of my four F's, I can feel my heart beating. Some people can't feel their heart. I can feel my heart, so I can, I notice when it changes a little bit. Um, my face gets beet red, so I'm aware of that, and my voice shakes. I can hear it. So these are just things that I've learned about myself, and it doesn't take much. Those are sort of early signals for me where I've learned to go, oh, okay, something is mobilizing me. Something is causing some hyperarousal for me. My feelings might be that I feel tense or anxious or panicky. Um, I might feel anger. And my thoughts might be, what's going on? Or I don't like this. Or oh, what am I going to do? And then of course we round this out with the other end of that range. But as we said, it's really the same thing. It's just sort of the other side of that coin of, as we said last time, we can think about that hyper arousal red zone 4 Fs as I'm being chased by a tiger, and that blue zone hypoarousal, I'm disconnected, I'm collapsed, I'm dissociated, as the tiger lives in my house, and I'm trying very hard to be as low energy as possible. And dissociation might be I don't want to be around for whatever is about to happen next, right? And I think we touched on this, but just to review, dissociation sounds like a big word, and sometimes we think about like um multiple personality disorder, what we now call dissociative identity disorder, or I wake up in a different city and I don't know how I got here. Those are very extreme, fairly rare forms of dissociation, but it happens much more commonly than that. It simply means that two things that are usually connected now aren't. Okay. So a good example of this is if you've ever been in a conversation with somebody where they start um, telling a really horrifying story, but they tell it with no emotion at all, kind of like a robot, or they're reading a grocery list to you. You might look at that and think, oh, I guess they're okay with it, or I guess they've, come to terms with it. But especially when it's that kind of flat robotic sort of thing, really what you're seeing is that the emotions that would normally go together with their words are now separated. Dissociation can also create some perceptual shifts. Some people will say, I feel like I'm floating on the ceiling looking down, or it felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. I won't bore you with the brain science of that, but it means that stress has caused some of the perceptual centers of the brain to shift how they typically work and what they typically are communicating with. So it creates a sensation of our body being disconnected. So those are the states that people go into when they are in that hypoaroused state. And just like with the 4 Fs, this is very normal. This is how all creatures, especially when we're talking about primates and humans, this is how we address threats. So if this is something that you don't like or that you wish didn't happen, it's important to remember that we can't outthink this. This will be happening by the time we recognize that it's going on. And so I've learned for myself, if I'm starting to feel a little dissociated or a little into a collapse state, what that feels like for me in my body, the sensations are sometimes I feel heavy or cold. Sometimes I can feel a little numb. I've learned about myself that if I start yawning a lot, that can be a signal that I'm going into a bit of a collapse state. My feelings are sometimes hopeless or powerless or like, or overwhelmed. And my thoughts will follow that same train. I may feel like, what's the point? Or I don't care. I may feel uninvested or uninterested in what's going on. So those are things that I've learned about myself. And the reason that I've gone into this in such detail is that I really encourage you to learn these patterns for you. What are those, especially those early signals that this may be what you're experiencing, because again, this is universal, right? All human beings do some version of all of these things in an effort to protect ourselves or get out of something that's potentially threatening or dangerous. And being able to recognize it means that we can work with it, which we'll talk more about at the second half of our training today. Now, oh, I love this quote, so we're going to have to talk about this a little bit. Bruce Perry is the childhood trauma version of Bessel van der Kolk. And in fact, he's come to Ohio to do trainings a number of times over the years. I don't know when he was here most recently, but I know, for example, that Franklin County brought him in a number of times to do trainings here. He did a lot of neuromapping with children to try to identify like what part of their brain is being activated and what part is relatively inactive when kids are in some trauma reactive state. So if you work with young people, if you have an interest in trauma, you're probably familiar with him. And if you're not, I highly recommend that you seek out some of his books and trainings. And here's why what he says is relevant to what we're talking about today, regardless of the age of the folks you're working with. I love this quote so much. He says, people usually want to teach other people from the top down, but the brain actually works from the bottom up. So here's what he's talking about. Remember when we talked about if we make our little hand brain like this, it's a decent representation of the major regions of the brain and what they primarily are involved with. So remember we talked about the heel of your hand and the little, wrist here is sort of like that little cauliflower stem at the bottom of your brain and the flat bottom of your brain. This goes up to a region that we typically refer to as the midbrain. But this area we usually will refer to as the brainstem. And as you probably remember, it takes care of all of the automatic functioning of the body. If there's no activity in the brainstem, we are dead. And then if you go to where your thumb is in the middle of your hand here, this is relatively the positioning of the limbic system, which is sort of in the middle of the brain. And the limbic system is involved with lots of things: memory, learning, reward, emotion regulation. It helps sort of direct traffic in the brain from sensory information that comes in. So it does lots and lots of things. But for our purposes, we're talking really about the amygdala, which, as you remember, are those, if you had two little almond-shaped freckles at the bottom corners of your thumb, that's of your thumbnail, that's about where the amygdala would be. And the amygdala, you remember, is the smoke detector of your brain. It is constantly asking, am I safe? And scanning everything that's going on. And then you remember the back of your hand and your fingers down your fingernails. It's a pretty good representation of the cortex, which is the last part of the brain to evolve or to develop as we are developing in the womb. It continues, some of areas of the cortex are continuing to develop and wire in with other parts of the brain up until maybe age 25 or so. So this is the part of the brain that's involved with self-awareness, reflection, projecting into the future, anticipating things. So like, if I punch my teacher, things are going to go badly for me. Making decisions. Should I punch my teacher or should I go talk to my counselor to calm down? That all happens in the cortex primarily. So what Perry is talking about here, remember when I said that when the amygdala gets some information that says, wah, wah, danger, danger, and that alarm system sets off that chain reaction in the brain and body, a couple of things happen that are very important for us to understand. First of all, if you could watch an fMRI of someone's brain so we could see in real time what parts of the brain are more active and what parts are relatively inactive, what we would see is that the middle and bottom of the brain are lit up like a Christmas tree. They are very involved in getting this system in gear and flooding the body with adrenaline and cortisol to try to get us safe, okay? But the top part of the brain would be relatively inactive. And it makes sense. Again, a pretty good analogy is if you're in a public building and there's a fire alarm gets pulled, then if you're in a building with elevators, they will stop working. If you have, let's say, an emergency lighting system, the regular lights will go off. This is typically how planes work. In the cabin, the regular lighting will go off and only the emergency lighting will be visible. And this all makes sense. It's a way to get safe as quickly as possible. You don't want people trapped in elevators. You don't want people getting confused in the plane. You want them to be able to see the aisle and get out. So anything that is not absolutely necessary is shut down. And your brains work the same way. Our brains are incredibly efficient, ruthlessly efficient. And if you don't need it, it's not going to be working because the brain's got to send all of that energy to the survival mechanisms in your brain. So what does this mean? Well, we've already talked about the fact that people really can't make choices and decisions. And we work with folks who may already have damage or difficulty with often the cortex of the brain. That's often where if there are anomalies or abnormalities or injuries to the brain, this is one of the most sensitive areas to that, and so we will often see issues there. So people who struggle with speech or reading or writing or decision making or things like that. Cortex, right? So we already work with a population who may have cortexes that work a little differently or already struggle with some of those operations. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a great example of that. Linking cause and effect is very difficult for people who have fetal alcohol syndrome, and it has damaged large parts of the cortex. Okay, so regardless, however your cortex and your frontal lobes work, if you are triggered into that survival protocol, that part of your brain is relatively inactive. That's why when my professor was dragged out of the movie theater, for those few seconds, all he could do was scream, but he couldn't put words together and he couldn't recognize what had happened and he couldn't explain what had happened to somebody else. After a few seconds out in the movie theater lobby and he calmed down a little bit, then he could sort of gather himself up and use his words again and explain to his wife and the movie theater manager kind of what had happened to him. But for those few seconds when he was triggered, he couldn't. Quick side note here. I want you to think about how often we are working with somebody where they are in their hyper aroused state, they're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or they're collapsed, and we are asking them to use their words. It's a great suggestion most of the time, unless that part of your brain is shut off. And for some people, it might only be a fleeting couple of seconds, and for other people, it might last a lot longer. But if they are far into one of those two red zones or blue zones, the language centers are in the cortex, so they won't process language very well. And they won't be able to use language very well. They might be able to scream, but they may not be able to talk. And those of you who've worked with people, especially if any of you have worked in like crisis settings, which is sort of where I grew up professionally, we learned that giving people complex instructions does not work when they are in that state. You use commands that are as simple as possible because their brain will not process language very well. It may not process language at all. And so what is Perry talking about when he says people want to teach other people from the top down? What he's saying is we usually want to work with people or intervene with people engaging the cortex. So I'm going to explain a lot of stuff to you, which hopefully you are all sitting here today and you're all feeling relaxed and chill and your brain is communicating normally and your amygdalas are calm. And so you have no problem taking in and processing fairly complex language from me. And you could even take notes at the same time or whatever. But imagine that there was suddenly a fire in your building. You're not going to be able to do that anymore. Your brain won't let you because your brain wants you to get out and doesn't want you to be distracted by anything else. So think about how often we are trying to intervene with someone or, tell them their consequences. If you don't stop it, you're going to lose your level, blah, 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 which may or may not matter to them anyway. But certainly in those moments, we are trying to engage a part of the brain that isn't working. And so what we need to do, this is the basis of what Perry is saying here, is we need to get into where that amygdala is and reassure the amygdala that that person is safe. So I don't know, let's say Jamal For whatever reason, whatever is going on, his amygdala is saying, is Jamal safe? No. Whoop, 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 whoop. We've got that whole alarm system going on. He's in that hyper aroused or hypo aroused state. If I'm going to work with him, if I want to get him thinking again, if I want him to be able to make decisions, right? Should I hit this person or should I, go get support and talk about my feelings? Well, that's a choice. In order for his brain to be able to make that choice or hear what I'm trying to tell him or remind him of his skills, hey, remember we practiced, blah, 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 blah. I need his thinking brain to be back online, which means I've got to start with the amygdala. I've got to start with the limbic system and the brainstem and help his body start sending the message back up to his brain that he is safe. That might mean we walk away from the thing that is triggering him. That might mean that I get everybody else out of the room. That might mean if any of you have any like sensory rooms, which I love because they line up beautifully with brain science. Maybe we go in the sensory room and we just look at the blacklight aquarium for a few minutes. When his amygdala calms down, and it doesn't have to be perfect, right? We just need to be heading in that direction. As his amygdala starts to calm down, Jamal will be able to come back online and be able to do whatever is baseline for him, which might be different from somebody else, but whatever his capacity is for problem solving or using language or processing what I'm saying or thinking logically. I've got to get that top brain back online. I've got to work from the bottom up. But we usually try to do it from the top down. And that is a mistake. So I could go on and on about this, but we're going to bring this to what the heart of trauma responsive care is. And again, don't worry so much about the limbic system, the vagus nerve stuff there. That's part of a longer training. But this is where we created trauma responsive care to take that next step beyond being informed. Being trauma informed is really important. It's the first step. And as I said last week, I've seen this tremendous leap forward in, I would say, all the helping professions, but very noticeably in DD in particular, how much better we are at being trauma informed. It's been wonderful. And now we're working on the next step, right? Which is, okay, now I know about trauma. I'm informed about it. What do I do with it? How do I respond to it? And as we'll see, it's not just about trying to get some better outcomes in the moment with folks, but as we wrap up today, we'll look forward a little and see how it really actually offers people opportunity to heal from trauma. And so when we say that trauma is about being unsafe and out of control, right, which makes sense. And not all stresses are traumas, but all traumas are stresses. So a stress that goes beyond our ability to deal with it, so we don't feel in control of what's happening or what we're doing. And it is unsafe. It is triggering that safety mechanism in our nervous system. Well, if that's what trauma is, unsafe and out of control, then if we want to help people be like all completely online in their brains and able to use their whole brain, we want them to feel safe and we want them to feel in control. So safe is pretty self-explanatory. And remember, what I experience as safe may not be what you experience as safe. My professor was not in danger in that movie theater. Nobody else probably felt unsafe the way that his nervous system believed him to be unsafe when whatever happened on screen, whatever it was, gunfire, an explosion, whatever it was, that made his nervous system react as if he were unsafe. So what was the first thing that started to help him feel safe again? Getting out of that movie. Okay. Again, folks who work with people who are on the autism spectrum will be very familiar with this. When people are sensorily overwhelmed, even if it's something that would not bother other people, doesn't matter, their alarm system reacts in the same way. You are watching people react the same way people with a traumatic experience react. So they go into that fight or flight, or they shut down, or they're trying to tune everything out or whatever. You get them out of that overwhelming environment. You go to, let's say Jamal, we're gonna put you on the autism spectrum for this. And so you love that sensory room. And when we can go in that sensory room and you can sit in your beanbag chair and we can watch the fish with the black light on or whatever, I don't know. we get away from the sensory input and you start to feel safe. Sometimes feeling safe is getting some different sensory input. So there's a common phrase that young people use these days about touching grass that used to be popular a few years ago. It just means go outside, get some input that's soothing, that can help our brains feel safe. So that makes sense. In control, just to be very, very clear, in control does not mean I am now the boss of everyone. I get to tell everyone what to do. It means I'm in control of myself. And as you remember, that means that all the parts of my brain, the cortex, the limbic system, and the brainstem, and the nervous system running throughout my body are all talking to each other. And now the part of my brain that can make decisions. Yes, I'm talking to Sabrina, and she asks me if I'd like to go for a walk instead of staying in this argument that's getting me increasingly triggered and upset. Yeah, I would like to go for a walk, Sabrina. That sounds like a great suggestion. So my cortex is back online. Neurally integrated means all the parts are working at their normal levels and they're communicating with each other. So you'll notice that I skipped a word in the middle there, which is connected. And for those of you who've done trauma-informed training, you'll recognize safe and in control. It may not use that same language, but a lot of trauma-informed care models, like the SAMHSA models or the Sanctuary model, or the different ones that are out there, those tend to be the two pillars of the model. So that's pretty universal. They may use different language like empowered or grounded or whatever, but those are pretty universal. Connected is something that we put in for trauma responsive care specifically based on brain science. So where the research currently is in this brain science area, here's what we're going to talk about next. You may remember both last week and today, I mentioned briefly the neurotransmitters that are released in the brain when that amygdala sets off that system of like, oh, something's not safe, wham, 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 and it gets that whole system triggered. There are many chemicals that the brain releases in those moments, but two of the main ones that we're concerned with today are norepinephrine and cortisol. And why do we care about this? Well, there's actually a really good reason, because our brains are unfathomably complex. We are still at the beginning of really understanding some of these systems of the brain and how things actually happen. But in other ways, the brain is based on really simple principles. Here's one: on and off. That's it, right? Your brain has a way of turning things on and then turning them off. And if you think about it for a second, that totally makes sense. If I want to take a sip of my tea, my brain has to trigger the sequence that will make me raise my hand and then swallow and then put my hand down. It's got to have a way of stopping that as well. Or if there's no way to stop, then I could start scratching my nose and never stop until my nose falls off. And in fact, there are a lot of neurological conditions that something has messed with the brain's ability to start and stop. So Parkinson's is a good example of this. If any of you are familiar with Parkinson's at all, there are a lot of things happening with Parkinson's, but one of the sort of classic features of it is that it can be hard to start a motion. The brain has a hard time with the on switch, but then it also can have trouble with the off switch, which is where we get uncontrolled movement or spasming or whatever. So on and off is really important. And we know now that norepinephrine and cortisol is the on switch for this emergency protocol. We could say that it's the on switch for fear. And as long as we're in that situation that is feeling unsafe, our brain is going to keep pumping out norepinephrine and cortisol, which is going to keep that sort of, feedback loop with the amygdala. And we don't want that. We want to turn it off. So if we know what the on switch is, we need to know what the off switch is. And you've probably already guessed it. The chemical off switch is dopamine and serotonin. They are chemical antagonists. That means that they literally break down chemically norepinephrine and cortisol. Think about like if you've got you're washing up the dishes and you've got like a pan full of greasy water and you drop a drop of liquid dish soap, what does it do? It breaks apart the grease molecules, right? So they go like bloop. That's roughly what happens when your brain starts producing more dopamine and serotonin. It literally starts breaking down all of that norepinephrine and cortisol that's floating around in your brain at that moment. So we can say that dopamine and serotonin are the off switch for fear. Now, what do we do to make our brains produce more dopamine and serotonin? Well, we do a lot of things. In fact, you've probably heard of these brain chemicals before because they're involved, again, in lots of different things. Serotonin is often involved with calming and relaxation. Serotonin plays a role with memory. So does dopamine. They're both involved with learning. I love this example of Sesame Street. If you remember Sesame Street, the greatest show ever, how do they help young children learn things? Well, you have like, the letter of the day, and there's the letter, and then there's a song or a Muppet pops up, or someone gets a pie in the face, and the child can sing the song or laugh or whatever. That releases a little bit of dopamine and serotonin in the brain, which helps encode the information. So, dopamine and serotonin are involved in memory and learning and lots of things. Dopamine in particular is involved a lot with rewards. So, lots of things release dopamine for us. Getting a little like on social media, or, winning a little round of Candy Crush, which I know is something only old people play. Another very popular source of dopamine is sugar and fat. And that's why we call those foods comfort foods. Kale salad might be great for you, but nobody ever called it a comfort food, right? And if you remember the pandemic, we all became experts in this form of brain science because we were all looking around all the time for any dopamine or serotonin we could find. So all the jokes from the pandemic about sitting on the couch and watching, reruns of The Office and eating mac and cheese. Very few people soothed themselves by eating kale and doing their taxes. They instinctively looked for those things that release dopamine and serotonin in the brain to try to bring down their fear and stress level. Gambling, sex, cocaine, basically anything human beings really like, dopamine and serotonin are involved. But one of the fastest, most powerful ways for the human brain to release dopamine and serotonin is connection with another caring human being. And that is why connected is in the middle here, because we know that the fastest way to start shifting that brain function to help people re-regulate or to help them get back into that window of accommodation, that window of tolerance, whatever phrase you want to use, the most powerful way to do that is to start releasing lots of dopamine and serotonin. And the most powerful way for most human beings to do that is to experience warmth and connection with another caring human being. So, many of you guys are already doing this, even if you weren't fully aware that that's what was happening. When you think about that young person or that individual where you just have that relationship with them, right? So if they're really in it, they are really having a day. You can walk in the room and start talking to them, and it's not like you've got a magic spell or anything. It's just that they feel safe around you. More importantly, they feel cared for by you. This is also helpful to keep in mind when I talked a few minutes ago about how if we are very frightened or triggered into our trauma or whatever it is, we're not going to be able to process complex language, but that's okay because people will respond to our body language, our facial expressions, and our tone of voice. I instinctively start softening my voice just talking about this. Think about a time that you've been very stressed or panicky. If you've had to talk to, let's say, I don't know, a nurse in an emergency room or someone on a helpline over the phone, you may have met that person 10 seconds earlier. So this doesn't have to be a big, long relationship. But if they are talking to you in a way that is soothing and calming and gentle, even if you don't speak the same language, we human beings can feel that very, very perceptively, right? There are individuals you work with where they may struggle with expressive language, that you may not be clear about how much perceptive language they have, but they can feel your vibe, right? So human beings on a very deep level evolved to be able to do this. So when we are interacting with someone in a way that fosters that connection, I'm in this with you. We will figure this out. Don't worry, I'm here. Let's see what we can do. It's not about having the magic spell. It's not about having an answer that immediately fixes the problem. It's about that person doesn't feel alone in what they're experiencing anymore. So that starts releasing dopamine and serotonin. And that is the most powerful way to get a brain back online, to soothe the amygdala, to help the amygdala stop sending out that emergency signal. And once the brain is back online, now you can start talking through options. Now you can remind them of their skills that you've been working on with them. Now you can help them think about the consequences to their behavior. But before that starts happening, there is no point. Okay, so what is trauma responsive care? Trauma responsive care is making sure that someone feels safe, connected, and in control before you do anything else. Bottom up, not top down. Don't try to engage this if this is offline. Spend your time helping that person feel safe, connected, and in control. And as they start moving back into that window, they don't have to be perfectly there. And for some of our folks, getting regulated again takes a long time. But you can see as the tide starts to turn, you can see them start to calm down. You can see that feeling of connectedness and safety is starting to take hold. And now you can start working to help get that brain back online. Okay. And I will mention again, just for those of you who are interested in learning more about this, I talk more about this in my book if you want to learn more about how trauma responsive care sets that up. But before we go into our break, I want to just put one more piece in the puzzle, and then we'll check for questions and comments. I would love to hear what you guys' thoughts are about all of this. The question then might be, well, who do we do this with? And when we, over the years, have done trauma responsive care training in agencies, there's often this point where people go, oh, we should screen for people's traumas. We should be assessing for trauma more. And I always say the same thing, which is, that's a great idea. You should definitely do that. And you will still miss people. Why? Well, remember last week when we talked about big T and little t trauma. Number one, people in this area in who are receiving any kind of DD services, they're not always believed, right? Let's just be really honest. They may talk about traumas and people don't necessarily believe them, or they dismiss them. They may not report what's going on, or they may struggle with expressive language and they haven't been able to tell anybody or communicate what's going on. So that's one problem. You're going to miss some big T trauma, but that's not even your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is little t, right? I've seen a number of instruments, good instruments, for trying to get at how many big T traumatic events someone may have experienced in their life. I've never seen an instrument like that accurately counts how many times a day someone feels disempowered or devalued or ignored or misunderstood or overwhelmed, right? And as we said last time, for some of your folks, that's kind of all day, every day. And so that's why, as we said, the estimates for how many people have been affected by potentially traumatic levels of stress in their life in the DD system, well, it's more than 90%. And for my money, if you're talking about more than 90%, you're basically saying everybody. So we recommend that people use safe, connected, and in control as a universal precaution. Assume that every student in your classroom, every individual in your agency, everybody you're working with needs to feel safe, connected, and in control before you ask them to do anything else. And just like universal precautions, it's okay if you're doing this with someone who doesn't really need it. So let's say that I'm an individual that you support and I get a cut and it's bleeding, like, kind of bleeding. What would you do? Well, you'd use universal precautions. You'd put on gloves before you potentially come in contact with my blood. Why? Because I might have a really serious illness that you can get if you've got like a little cut or abrasion or something that you may not even be aware of. We all understand this. And what happens if you take that extra couple of seconds and you put on those gloves and you help me clean up the wound and you help me put a Band-Aid on, and I don't have a blood-borne illness? You didn't need the gloves. What has it cost you? Nothing. Fractions of a penny for those gloves, a couple extra seconds. So it's worth it, right? It is worth the potentially unnecessary precaution, because you're not going to be able to tell a lot of times if I'm sick or not. And you don't want to guess and get it wrong the other way. If you look at me and you go, she seems all right, you might have a life-threatening illness as a result of that, right? So the other thing that's important about that is that it doesn't hurt me. Even if I don't have a blood-borne illness, you putting on gloves doesn't hurt me. You're not giving me a course of antiviral injections, right? That would be weird. You're not taking 2 weeks to get results from the blood lab, all the while I'm still bleeding. So it doesn't harm me, and it doesn't cost you anything to treat me as if I need to feel safe, connected, and in control. And if I am one of the 5% or less of people you come into contact with who haven't had significant levels of traumatic stress, I'm still going to benefit from this. I like feeling safe, connected, and in control. I think that's a pretty universal human need. So we treat everyone as if they have potentially traumatizing levels of stress, and we need to help them feel safe, connected, and in control before we do anything else with them. So we're going to pause there. That's where we'll pick things up after our break. But before we go to the break, I'm going to stop the share, and we're going to see if there are any comments or questions that folks have. And I'm going through here, and it looks like we have attendance at this point, so that sounds great. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Oh, it's exactly 11. That doesn't usually work out. So I will see you guys back here at 10 after. And during the break, if there are any comments or questions or things you'd like to add to the discussion, put them in the chat section.